The World Food Programme says those displaced by war in Sudan are living with hunger. Most affected areas include North Darfur and other regions. Sudan war has been ongoing between the army and paramilitary rapid support forces since April last year. Joining us to discuss this a little bit further, we have Leni Kinzli, who's from the World Food Programme and the spokesperson for Sudan. Leni, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. 54% of the population in Sudan living with acute food insecurity. More than half of the population there.
Indeed, this is the world's worst hunger crisis at the moment, and it is the worst catastrophe in terms of hunger and number of people that are suffering that has hit Sudan in more than 2 decades. The situation is absolutely catastrophic. There are 755,000 people who are in the highest level of food insecurity in catastrophic conditions, who are barely struggling to survive each day. We're hearing reports of people eating leaves, eating grass, and now the confirmation that there is famine in Zamzam IDP camp, just 12 kilometers outside of the capital of North Darfur in Al Fasher. And we are extremely concerned, but there is still time to turn this around and prevent famine from spreading. But for that, WFP and other aid agencies urgently need expanded access and a cessation of hostilities so that we can safely deliver life-saving, vital food supplies to people who are staring starvation in the face.
Yeah, and also, Leni, it's most of the states as well, 14 out of the 18 states, you will find people who are living with acute food insecurity there as well. What are the challenges that you face as an organization as you try and assist and provide food and aid in these states?
The biggest challenge is access, and that means safely being able to deliver assistance at scale to these locations, conflict hotspots that are most affected, like the capital Khartoum, the Kordofan region, the Darfur region, because fighting is ongoing and both parties to the conflict are interfering with the delivery of aid, whether that's through bureaucratic impediments, security threats against transporters, imposition of taxes and fees to transport assistance across checkpoints. And so for that, we urgently need unfettered humanitarian access, and both parties to the conflict should guarantee such under international humanitarian law.
I shudder to think this, Leni, but should you not get that, then what?
Then it is going to be an extremely dire situation for the Sudanese people. As I said, this is already the world's worst hunger crisis. And the longer the conflict goes on and the longer we are not able to deliver assistance, the more catastrophic the situation will get, to an absolutely unimaginable nightmare for the Sudanese people trying to struggle to survive. And this should not even come into question in the 21st century, when there is enough food in the world, when we have food ready to deliver. It's just a matter of will and allowing that access.
And the little bit of food that really is there and in the areas where there is access to people as well, just thinking of the main market, Zamzam, that you also mentioned too. But food prices are on the increase as well. If we're just looking at the costs here, 63% increase for cooking oil, 190% increase to buy sugar, 75% increase for rice. I mean, how are these people expected to pay such exorbitant prices for food in the middle of a war?
Exactly. That's the other big challenge, aside from food availability, is the access to food in terms of the affordability of it. We're seeing record levels of inflation. As you mentioned, food prices are skyrocketing. The price of wheat is up by 61%, and it's simply not possible for people to afford it. What I'm hearing from my colleagues on the ground at the moment is that people and communities are getting by sharing what they have, pooling resources. But eventually those resources and the money is going to run out, and sharing will no longer be an option because there's nothing left. And that's why the time to act is now. We have been doing the best we can over the last 16 months since this conflict started to deliver aid to the most vulnerable communities, to those trapped in conflict. Much more needs to be done. We are ramping up, but again, for that, we need the expansion of humanitarian access. We need every single humanitarian corridor possible open, because otherwise the Sudanese people will be left to fend for themselves.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, just sharing some anecdotes there, that people are even left to eating grass. If you could just share more about just the livelihood, just the lifestyle and what's going on there now and the living conditions.
So the living conditions, and it very much depends on exactly where people are, but the living conditions are extremely dire. In Darfur, for example, it was already very difficult for people to find jobs, have livelihoods before the conflict. To remember, there were millions of people displaced from the Darfur wars in the early 2000s. I myself have been to Zamzam camp several times. People already were reliant on food assistance then, and living in makeshift shelters. And the conflict has now driven more and more people into displacement. It's the world's largest displacement crisis, with more than 10 million people who have fled from their homes, living sometimes out on the open in streets. And like I mentioned, going to the most extreme measures just to be able to afford to eat anything. And especially in some of these hard-hit areas, we're hearing exactly that. People are eating grass off the ground, leaves off the trees, and also in some cases eating the dirt off the ground. And that's because they just have nothing left.
What a dire situation. I really hope there is an intervention there. And thank you so much for your work there too and joining us this afternoon.